mainstream media, I think that we see a lot about the idea that so-called ethnic minorities are allegedly taking over the world. And I think recently many of us have followed the CBSA border security raids this spring and the related Vancouver-based reality TV show, which was canceled after so much public outcry. And now in the current summer 2013 issue of Vancouver magazine, which I was reading this afternoon, I saw an illustrated map of Vancouver that was attached to a story about real estate and about how it's actually easy to get in there and buy a house. I didn't read the article, but I was so fascinated by the map because the map uses the names of international neighborhoods or cities to describe cities in Vancouver. So it places names like the Castro onto the West End, which is where I live. And then obviously Mount Pleasant is called Williamsburg. But then it becomes much more troubling as we move to other parts of the city and we see the most westerly tip of Point Grey called Macau. And then the entire area south of Broadway and east of Main is called Hanoi. So the punchline for the reader, I guess, who's in on this joke is about certain neighborhoods or how certain blocks of real estate are consumed and occupied by so-called foreign investors. And I see that map as just one of many examples of how mainstream media reflects the public mood in Vancouver around real estate and housing. And the mood is derisive in all kinds of very small and very revealing ways. So we'll also read articles in newspapers like 24 Hours called Minority Report, and those are articles about how so-called ethnic minorities are outstripping Caucasians in Metro Vancouver, and that's only going to continue as we move on into the future. And then we'll also hear that reaction to those discussions in the media reflected in our everyday lives. And I'll hear, a couple of newlyweds who are openly discussing about how they don't want to be the only white people in the neighborhood as they search a place to set down roots, to buy a home and start a family. Or I also hear in casual conversation at a party about a teacher at a Westside secondary school who is worried about the future of the humanities department where he teaches because the school, he says, is becoming so focused on the sciences because that's what all of the immigrant students want to learn, and the good stuff that he gets to teach in the humanities department is not being able to come out. Or then I'll also be teaching in a community journalism class for inner city residents. And then people come into the class and they tell me that they were called a chink on the way over on the street again. And then their same classmates will also privately tell me about the derision that they feel towards the Chinese people taking up space in the SROs that they feel are their own and that they don't want to give up space in. So all of this is very public and very dominant discourse about the seemingly flamboyant or perverse wealth of newcomers from Taiwan and Hong Kong and China. But what that does is it erases the experiences of hundreds of other Chinese language speakers in Vancouver. And it also acts to drive their issues further onto the margins of a relatively racist society. So this year I had a chance to write and research a series of articles for the Thai Solutions Society that reveals a housing crisis in Chinatown among Chinese-speaking seniors. And I found that in doing the research and conducting the interviews with people who are living in Chinatown, it showed that to me the urban myths around foreign investment, that all newcomers are rich, or that all Chinese people are rich, or that all Chinese people are wealthy enough to own their own homes is actually untrue. And I remember back in 2009, a researcher who Nate was mentioning, his name is Andy Yan. He's also a professor at UBC and he's with Bing Tom Architects. That year he embarked on a study to examine the myth of empty condos downtown. And at that time he showed through the work, he looked at BC Hydro data that the empty condos were actually a myth. In fact, only 5.5% of 2,400 downtown condo units were empty. This is in 2009, and this is according to BC Hydro data that he was able to use. And he also found that non-Canadian, so I guess that would be implied to be foreign investors, owned only 6% of those condos. And of that 6% of people who were foreign investors who owned those condos downtown, only 2% were from countries in Asia. And most of the empty condos were traced to owners actually living in the United States. But those facts, that kind of research often gets swept under the rug in favor of more troubling paranoia around who precisely has power or money in Vancouver these days, because maybe the two seem like they're hard to come by. So we might be quick to behave derisively towards newcomers from East Asia who are living in big West Side homes. And I think a more nuanced conversation is very desperately needed, so I'm glad that this is happening tonight. And I think that we also get lost in these fast judgments and ignore the realities and lived experiences of newcomers, whether they are low-income folks in Chinatown or people who are homeowners in the West Side. Because even those people who do own homes, I know, and this is related to other research that I've been doing, I've found that home ownership doesn't always signify that people are necessarily doing well or have good quality of life or good mental health. And according to interviews that I conducted on an upcoming series with academics who have studied it, they found that newcomers to Canada sometimes feel pushed or pressured into home ownership when they can't actually afford a house. And I've also read research with people who've conducted interviews with residents of West Side homes, and those residents talk extensively about their own difficulty in finding employment in Vancouver, which can also lead to difficulties around mental health, family strain, family breakdown. Many newcomers who own homes are assets rich, but they're also earnings poor because they're feeling shut out of the job market here. And I've also tutored high school students in another life who live in the West Side, and whose families are divided across continents, where these kids are living with their siblings and their mom here while their father works and lives elsewhere. And their own pressure to succeed and to build something for themselves here is enormous, and it's sometimes unsustainable. And so these aren't happy tales of exorbitantly rich people gallivanting across the city and ostensibly subscribing to Vancouver magazine. But then in the inner city, in Chinatown, we're also seeing a much more acute housing crisis playing out among Chinese-speaking seniors who move back to Chinatown to spend the last years of their lives. And this is an experience that my own grandfather had, where he moved himself from Hastings Sunrise and into Chinatown to spend his last years, or actually last months, and then he passed away in a hospice in the downtown east side. And I didn't know this at that time, but based on interviews that I conducted this year through the Thai Solutions Society, I found that a number of people living in the Chinatown SROs have lived in Vancouver, maybe since middle age, like in their 40s or their 50s. But then they moved into Chinatown after their children grew up and after they'd finished taking care of the grandkids, and they ended up living alone in Chinatown. And I found that Chinatown is a really especially important place for elders, and it's one of the only places where they feel like they're understood, and it's one of the only places where they really feel at home. And Chinatown in Vancouver is different from Richmond. I think it plays a different role because for some people it's easier to get around Chinatown because they don't have to drive. It's smaller and sort of easier to navigate geographically. And also the housing, especially rental housing, is more affordable and in some ways more plentiful, although it's still a difficulty in terms of vacancy there, because the demand for housing for inner city Chinese-speaking seniors is only expected to grow as time goes on. And so just quickly, based on some of the research that I was able to do for the Thai Solutions Society, I found a 2011 report from the UBC Center for Urban Economics and Real Estate, and it estimated that at least 3,300 Chinese seniors who lack the wealth to be homeowners will need supportive housing over the next 20 years. And also, compared to other groups, there is more likely to be demand for culturally relevant seniors housing options for Asian Canadian elderly than we're seeing for elderly in other ethnic groups. That demand is higher for Chinese language speakers than that of all other non-official languages combined. But of course, that doesn't ignore the fact that general Metro Vancouver seniors across all ethnicities are needing housing, and the population of seniors is growing steadily. So this year in March, the Social Planning and Research Council of BC released a report that showed that the seniors population in Metro Vancouver is expected to increase by 115% over the next 20 years. Also, that seniors' issues are necessarily feminist issues, there are 122 senior females for every 100 males. And as of 2006, 44.3% of senior-led households in Metro Vancouver were in core housing need. And there's been a 44.8% increase of the number of people on waiting lists for senior social housing between 2009 and 2012. So, I mean, we could ask a question about why so many Chinese seniors in precarious housing situations are living in the inner city. Well, I think that it's important to note that family breakdown happens across all cultures, and poverty affects all communities, not just the English language community. And also, compounding the poverty in the inner city, Chinese elders are subject to very troubling and terrible racism, which is widely felt and very widely observed. But it's also a concern that there is a real lack of bilingual outreach workers in the inner city who are able to work with seniors. And I've also observed that there's a very limited amount of data and research done on this population and about what possibilities exist around solutions. So I'll leave this part of my talk here with just some information that I gathered from the one study that I read in Vancouver about Chinese-speaking seniors. And it's a 2007 study through the UBC School of Social Work and the City of Vancouver. There are no online copies of this report. I was only able to get a printed copy, so if people are interested in it, you can let me know and we can try to arrange like scanning or photocopying or something. But according to the interviews that were done through this study with building or SRO managers or seniors focus groups, it was found that discrimination and racism were the top concerns when people were asked across the spectrum to identify the needs and gaps facing elders. And that discrimination and racism was followed by language barriers and a lack of translation services. And then third on the list was lack of information, education, and advocacy. So based on my research, I mean, I think where the primary gaps lie are on, you know, in all of those spaces that we might not see publicly. I think that maybe I kind of have a limited perspective in that I feel as though I'm quite aware of the numerous mobilization efforts and protest actions and press conferences that are happening in the inner city on a pretty regular basis. But I think that there need to be many more resources directed to on-the-ground outreach and translation work. And also, we need to learn from other cities that are doing this better than us. Like New York City released a very comprehensive report about the situation facing seniors in the New York City area back in the early 2000s. And I think that a similar effort here would be certainly useful. And then lastly, I think we can learn from seniors care models like those in San Francisco and surrounding municipalities, which look more closely at holistic care for people rather than just one singular kind of housing first approach. So that's the information that I'll share now, but I look forward to more questions and discussions, and we'll move on with Pablo.